Bolivia is gearing up for a pivotal general election on August 17th, 2025, when voters will choose a new president, vice president, and the entire legislature. If no presidential candidate wins outright, a runoff election is slated for October 19th, 2025. This election arrives amid high political drama. Incumbent President Luis Arce has announced he will not run for re-election, and his predecessor, Evo Morales, Bolivia's longest-serving former president, has been barred from the race by authorities enforcing term limits. These twists leave the field open. The ruling left-wing movement for socialism, MAS, is split, and a host of opposition candidates see an opening to reshape Bolivia's future. Bolivia is emerging from a turbulent few years that saw a disputed election in 2019, an interim government, and the comeback by MAS in 2020. Now with economic anxieties rising and key figures sidelined, the 2025 general election is viewed as a crossroads moment for Bolivia's democracy. The outcome will not only decide who leads this country of 12 million, but also how Bolivia navigates challenges like economic instability and the fate of its vast natural resources. This includes the world's largest lithium reserves, which gives this election global significance. To understand what's at stake, let's briefly explain how Bolivia's elections work. Bolivia's political system is a presidential democracy with a bicameral legislature. The president and the vice president as his running mate is elected directly by the people for a 5-year term. To win the first round, a candidate needs over 50% of the vote, or at least 40%, with a 10-point lead over the nearest rival. If no one meets the threshold, the top 2 candidates go into a runoff election, which in this case will be held in mid-October 2025. This 2-round system, with the 40% 10% rule, is a unique feature designed to ensure that the president has broad support. Bolivia's legislature is a plurinational assembly, which has 2 chambers. A lower chamber consisting of 130 members, called the Chamber of Deputies, and an upper chamber with 36 senators. How are they elected? The system is a mixed proportional format. In the Chamber of Deputies, half the 130 seats, so 65 seats, are elected in a single-member districts from across the country, essentially a first-past-the-post race in local constituencies. The other half are elected by proportional representations from party lists, allocated based on each party's share of the national vote for president or legislator. Importantly, 7 of those seats are reserved for indigenous peoples and are chosen by indigenous communities according to their traditional customs, rather than party slates. This gives Bolivia's indigenous groups a direct voice in parliament, a feature of the 2009 constitution's aim to build a plurinational state inclusive to its many ethnic groups. Meanwhile, the 36 senators are elected by proportional representation at the department level, which is a state level in Bolivia. Bolivia has 9 departments, and each elects 4 senators. Voters cast a ballot for a party's slate of Senate candidates in their department, and the seats are allocated according to the vote share. This means the Senate reflects regional preferences. For example, the Department of La Paz elects 4 senators, Santa Cruz elects 4, and so on, ensuring all regions, big or small, have equal representation in the upper house. Every Bolivian citizen 18 years or older has the right to vote. Registration on electoral rolls is required. Voting in Bolivia is compulsory by law, which contributes to typically high turnout rates, often above 80%. On election day, Bolivia practically shuts down for a Dia de Votación. Alcohol sales are banned and travel is restricted during voting hours. These measures, along with unremovable ink to mark voters' fingers, are intended to prevent fraud and double voting. Polls are generally open from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., and anyone in line by closing time is allowed to vote. Elections are managed by an independent authority known as the Plurinational Electoral Organ, or OEP, headed by the Supreme Electoral Tribunal, or TSE, and supported by departments and electoral tribunals. The TSC oversees everything from voter registration to vote counting, and its independence is protected by law. Balloting in Bolivia is done with paper ballots and manual counting, with party representatives observing the count at each polling station. Results from local tally sheets are then transmitted digitally to the central electoral system, This manual vote system provides a paper trail, enhancing transparency and cybersecurity resilience, though it also means final results can take time to tabulate. Another distinctive element of Bolivia's elections is Bolivia elects its judges directly. While it's outside of the scope of the general election, it reflects how Bolivia's electoral process incorporates direct democracy even for institutions usually appointed elsewhere. Bolivia's 2025 election features an unprecedented situation. The incumbent president and the most famous ex-president are not on the ballot. President Luis Arce, who won a landslide victory in 2020, has, in his words, declined my candidacy for presidential re-election. Arce made this surprise announcement in May of 2025, saying he didn't want to split his movement's vote and risk handing a victory to what he called a fascist right-wing project. Essentially, deep divisions within the ruling MAS party drove Arce to bow out. At the same time, Bolivia's constitutional court definitively barred Evo Morales from running, reaffirming a 2-term limit for presidents. Morales had already served 3 terms, from 2006 to 2019, and tried to claim a 4th, which sparked a constitutional crisis a few years ago. Now the courts have shut the door on this comeback. Dramatic development, giving Morales' outsized role in Bolivian politics for over a decade. Morales, however, did not give up quietly. In the lead-up to the candidate registration deadline, the former president attempted to sneak onto the ballot by partnering with minor political parties after his own MAS party chose someone else. He tried to ally himself with small parties, like FPV and PAMBOL, but these maneuvers failed. The Supreme Electoral Tribunal rejected his late candidacy submission, noting that PAMBOL had lost its legal status due to poor showing in the last election, where it didn't meet the 3% vote threshold. In other words, Morales had no legally recognized party vehicle by the time he tried to register. His team called foul, calling it a blow to democracy, and accused the TSC of using procedural technicalities to exclude him. The dispute set off protests by Morales' supporters in his stronghold of Chapera, a cacao-growing region. They blockaded roads and clashed with police, warning of more unrest if their leader remains banned. With the 2 heavyweights out, who is running for president? The ruling MAS party has put forward Eduardo del Castillo, or known as Lalo, a former minister of the interior known for his loyalty to President Arce. Del Castillo is effectively Arce's hand-picked candidate to carry the MAS banner. However, not all of MAS is united behind him. A breakaway MAS faction aligned with Morales is backing Andronico Rodriguez, a young MAS senator and a cacao leader once seen as Morales' protege. Andronico leads an alliance called Alianza Popular, separate from the official MAS. This means the traditional pro-MAS vote base, which is sizable, especially in rural and indigenous communities, could split between 2 leftist candidates. That internal rivalry is a major storyline of this election, MAS versus MAS, or as some call it, Arce's MAS versus Evo's MAS. The rift within the party has dominated Bolivia for years, and it might open the door for some opposition. On the opposition side, the political landscape is fragmented. One prominent contender is Samuel Doria Medina, a businessman and leader of the center-right National Unity Front, or UN, who has run for president before. Doria is campaigning on economic pragmatism and anti-corruption, and recent polls have put him in front with roughly 20% support in a crowded field. Another key candidate is Manfred Reyes Villa, a conservative former mayor of Cochabamba and ex-presidential candidate from the early 2000s. Reyes Villa heads a coalition, often referred to as Sumante, and appeals to more right-leaning voters and those disenchanted with MAS's long rule. Also in the mix is Jorge Quiroga, also known as Tuto, a former Bolivian president from 2001 to 2002, representing a coalition of center-right groups. Rodrigo Paz Pereira, the former mayor of Teria and son of a past president, is running as well, backed by a Christian Democratic Alliance. From the eastern city of Santa Cruz, Johnny Fernandez, the current mayor of Santa Cruz de la Sierra, is running under the banner of UCS party, fronting an alliance called La Fuerza du Pueblo. Another candidate is Eva Copa, a young former MAS politician and once mayor of El Alto who broke with Morales. She's heading a new left-leaning party called Morena, with a running mate who was a spokesperson for President Arce. In total, TSC initially registered 10 presidential candidates from across the spectrum, from socialist to center-left to evangelical conservatives, making this one of Bolivia's most diverse and unpredictable races in recent memory. Notably absent is Carlos Mesa, a centrist former president who was a runner-up in the 2019 and 2020 elections. Mesa's Citizen Community, or CC, coalition remains a major opposition bloc in parliament, but Mesa himself chose not to run at this time, possibly to avoid further splitting of the opposition. Instead, CC has thrown its support behind other candidates. Another figure, Luis Fernando Camacho, the right-wing governor of Santa Cruz known for leading the 2019 anti-Morales protest, is also out of the picture. He's currently jailed on charges related to that protest, so his party had to regroup without him. These absences, in a way, leveled the playing field among opposition contenders. With so many players, it's no surprise that no clear frontrunner has crystallized yet. Polls fluctuate and second round looks very likely. For the first time in nearly 20 years, there's a real chance that MAS could lose its presidency, not because of a united opposition, but because of its own divided house and the country's wariness with economic troubles. Bolivia's economy, once growing rapidly under Morales, has stumbled. Inflation hit its highest rate in a decade recently, and its currency has been under pressure with dwindling central bank reserves. And the country that used to export natural gas is now facing fuel shortages and importing gas. These issues have dented public confidence in the current MAS government and given the opposition an opening to campaign on promises of change and better management. And ethnic dynamics are also at play. The resource-rich eastern lowland department of Santa Cruz, which is more conservative and anti-MAS, has long clashed with the highland MAS strongholds. In late 2022, Santa Cruz led a 36-day general strike, demanding a faster national census, hoping to gain more legislative seats and federal funds from an updated population count. President Arce's government eventually scheduled the census for 2024, but it was too late to redistribute congressional seats for 2025, frustrating Santa Cruz leaders. This inflamed regional tensions and the rhetoric of Eastern Lowlands versus Western Highlands, an enduring theme in Bolivian politics. How these regional grievances translate into votes and potentially protests is something to watch during this election. Bolivia's 2025 general election is more than a routine democratic exercise. It's a turning point for a nation at a crossroads. On one hand, the MAS movement that reshaped Bolivia over the past 2 decades is fighting to maintain power aimed internal fractures. On the other, a diverse opposition senses an opportunity to end an 18-year of near-continuous MAS rule. The stakes are high. The next government will face the task of stabilizing the economy, bridging the deep social divides, and deciding how to manage Bolivia's strategic resources, especially lithium and natural gas. International investors and neighboring governments will keenly be watching how this election outcome could influence Bolivia's stance on resource development and foreign partnerships. This election is also seen as a part of a larger story in Latin America, the ebb and flow of the pink tide of leftist governments. A defeat for MAS would mark a significant shift in the region's political map, while a victory could rejuvenate the left's project in Bolivia. Furthermore, the credibility of a democratic institution is on the line. A peaceful, transparent election followed by acceptance of the results will strengthen Bolivia's democracy and show that the country has learned from its crisis in 2019. Conversely, a disputed outcome or post-election conflict could plunge Bolivia back into instability and test the resilience of its constitutional order. As of now, the outcome is highly uncertain. The possibility of a runoff looms, which could force Bolivia's polarized factions to make hard choices and alliances in October. Voters must weigh continuity versus change and stability versus leadership. Many younger voters who only remember MAS governments are getting involved, but economic dissatisfaction has undercut the old certainties. No matter who wins, the next president will have a limited mandate unless they can build consensus across Bolivia's divides. Highland versus lowland, indigenous versus non-indigenous, left versus right. This is Global Election Wire, where we make elections make sense.